The carriage rolled through the iron gates of Ashworth Hall just as an autumn drizzle began to streak the window glass. Eleanor set aside her embroidery and rose, smoothing the dove-gray muslin that hung on her frame. 2 years of marriage had taught her that the Duke's homecomings demanded composure, not warmth. He strode into the entrance hall shaking rain from his greatcoat, dark hair swept back, attention already fixed on the leather satchel his secretary carried behind him. A cold gust of damp air followed, and the footman scrambled to close the doors. "Your Grace," Eleanor inclined her head. Eleanor, Julian Ashworth, 6th Duke of Ashworth, did not break stride. "Have tea sent to the study. I shall be occupied until supper." She watched him disappear down the corridor, his voice already handing instructions to his steward about parliamentary bills and shipping routes. The scent of sandalwood and rain lingered in the empty hall, a ghost of a presence she had not felt for 6 months. Supper came and went. She sat at the far end of the mahogany table, the candelabra throwing long shadows between them. He read a letter beside his plate, muttering about the Prince Regent's latest folly. She cut her lamb into precise, silent pieces. "I trust the estate has been agreeable in my absence," he said, not looking up. "Perfectly agreeable." "Good," a page turned. "I shall likely return to London after the Thornbury matter is settled, a fortnight no more." Eleanor set down her fork. The Thornbury matter, a boundary dispute with a neighboring baron. She had managed it herself 2 months ago with the land agent, sending the signed agreement to his London solicitor. He did not know. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. What point was there? She was a silhouette at his table, a voice that carried no weight. Later, unable to sleep, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and wandered the unlit gallery. The house felt like a mausoleum, portraits of Ashworth ancestors sneering down at her. She paused near the steward's room, a sliver of lamplight beneath the door. The Duke's voice drifted through. "A duty to the title. I have done my part. An heir would settle matters, but the lady seems content in her quiet. Frankly, it suits my purposes." The steward murmured something. The Duke replied, "Leave the estate in her hands if you must. She requires little and gives less trouble, a practical arrangement." Eleanor stood rooted to the carpet. The words were not cruel in their delivery, they were simply indifferent. She was a piece of furniture he had acquired, something that functioned without attention, a practical arrangement. She returned to her bedchamber, but dawn found her still awake, watching the gray light seep across the ceiling. When the maid arrived, she dressed without speaking and slipped from the house before breakfast. The grounds stretched beyond the formal gardens into a wilderness of old yew hedges and tangled oaks. She had never explored this far. The park had been designed a century ago by a landscape architect with a taste for controlled vistas, but this corner had been allowed to run wild. Briars caught at her skirts. A moss-coated stone bench lay half-sunken in the earth. And there, behind a curtain of ancient ivy, she saw it, a gate. Wrought iron, rusted to the color of dried blood, set into a high brick wall smothered in climbing hydrangea. The gate stood ajar, as if someone had once left in a hurry and never returned. She pushed it open. The hinges groaned, a sound like an old argument. Inside lay a walled garden, perhaps an acre, entirely forgotten. Rose bushes had grown into woody thickets, their hips hanging like tiny garnets. A cracked sundial stood at the center, and a small stone folly, half collapsed but still roofed, nestled in the far corner. Purple asters and wild foxgloves pushed through the gaps in the flagstones. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, a sweetness edged with melancholy. Eleanor stood motionless. The quiet here was not the empty silence of the great house. It hummed with hidden life, a thrush rustling in the undergrowth, the distant drip of water from a broken gutter, her own breath catching. She felt something loosen behind her ribs. She did not weep. Weeping required energy she had long since spent. Instead, she walked to the sundial and traced its moss-cloaked inscription, Tempus fugit, time flies. She had all the time in the world and none at all. The Duke left for Thornbury the following morning. He did not ask why her hem was damp with dew, nor why a smear of soil darkened her thumbnail when she handed him his dispatch case. He merely nodded, climbed into the carriage, and vanished down the drive. Elinor watched until the carriage was a speck. Then she turned and walked, almost ran, back toward the forgotten garden. Part 2. Weeks folded into months. Autumn surrendered to a raw winter, then softened into a late spring that painted the walled garden in washes of bluebell and wild primrose. Elinor visited every morning after breakfast, a trug over her arm, secateurs she had borrowed from the head gardener tucked into her apron pocket. She said nothing to the servants. The garden became a secret she held close, a world that belonged to her alone. She pruned the climbing roses until her palms blistered through her gloves. She unearthed a stone bench from a grave of ivy, scrubbed it clean, and sat upon it in the afternoons, sketching the progress of the beds. The folly, she discovered, was sturdy beneath its shroud of wisteria. She swept its flagstone floor, propped the shutters open, and placed a chipped vase on the windowsill to hold whatever she clipped. The Duke's letters arrived on the first of each month, brief and bloodless. The session drags on. I shall return when matters permit. See that the roof of the east wing is inspected. No greeting. No signature beyond a slashing initial. She read them, then folded them into tiny squares and tucked them inside the sundial's base, where rain could not reach. She spoke little to anyone. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pretty, remarked once that the Duchess looked peaked, but Elinor dismissed the concern with a murmured word about the change in season. In truth, her appetite had withered. Sleep came in fragments. The chill of the garden clung to her bones long after she returned indoors, but she did not care. The garden was worth any cost. One afternoon in May, the sky turned the color of bruised plums. Elinor was on her knees in the far border, wrestling a tangle of bindweed from a peony shoot when the heavens opened. Rain descended in silver sheets, drenching her within seconds. She laughed, a strange, ragged sound she barely recognized, and let the water stream down her face. It felt like being scrubbed clean. By the time she reached the house, her teeth chattered violently. She ordered a hot bath and told Mrs. Pretty she had merely been caught in the shower. A tisane would suffice. The cough began 3 days later, a dry, persistent tickle at first, easily hidden behind a handkerchief, then a raw scrape in her chest when she drew breath. She ignored it. The peonies were about to bloom, and the old Bourbon rose she had coaxed back from a single living cane was showing buds. She would not abandon them. The Duke returned to Ashworth Hall on the 1st of June, unannounced, as was his custom. He strode through the entrance hall expecting the quiet order of routine. Instead, he found Mrs. Pretty flustered, the housemaids whispering, and no sign of his wife. "Where is her Grace?" he asked, irritation flickering. "We thought she was in the library, Your Grace, but she has not been seen since luncheon. Her maid said she mentioned the garden." "The garden, the walled garden to the east." Mrs. Pretty twisted her apron. "I do not know of any walled garden, sir. She often walks the grounds, but she does not say where." A muscle tightened in his jaw. He had stood in this house 5 minutes and already something was amiss. He strode outside without removing his coat. The rain had stopped, but the sky still glowered. He quartered the formal gardens, found them empty, and pushed further into the wilder reaches of the park, branches snatching at his sleeves. Then he saw the iron gate, half hidden, with fresh footprints in the mud before it. He pushed through and stopped. The garden was a shock of color and order. Roses climbed trellises he did not recall existing. Paths had been cleared. A sundial stood polished, its bronze gnomon glinting. And there, slumped against the base of the Folly's doorstep, was Elinor. Her dress was soaked through, her hair plastered to her skull. One hand lay palm up, curled around a weed she had not finished pulling. Her lips were tinged with blue, and her face bore the hectic flush of fever. "Elinor!" He dropped to his knees, heedless of the wet stone. She did not stir. He touched her cheek and found it burning. "Elinor!" She muttered something unintelligible and tried to turn away. He gathered her into his arms, her weight startlingly slight. She had grown thin. When had she grown so thin? He carried her through the garden gate, past the bewildered servants, and up the main staircase, barking orders for the physician. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and a sound like a sob escaped her cracked lips. He laid her on the bed in her chamber and stood over her, his heart hammering with a sensation he could not name, a sensation that felt terrifyingly close to panic. Part 3. The physician arrived within the hour, a grave man named Dr. Harlow who smelled of camphor and pessimism. He listened to Alina's chest, counted her pulse, and drew the Duke into the corridor. "Inflammation of the lungs, Your Grace. The fever is severe. She has been unwell for some time and neglected it. I will bleed her and apply a mustard poultice, but her constitution is weakened. The next 48 hours will determine the outcome." Julian stood rigid, still in his mud-splattered boots. "You are telling me my wife may die?" "I am telling you to prepare yourself, sir." Dr. Harlow inclined his head and returned to the sick room. Julian did not follow. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stared out at the park, seeing nothing. The practical arrangement, the duty to the title, the woman who required little and gave less trouble. His own words, delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once considered their weight. He entered her chamber and dismissed the maid. A chair was drawn to the bedside. He sat and took her hand. Her fingers were limp and hot, the knuckles chapped from garden work. He traced the calluses with his thumb, these badges of labor he had never bothered to notice. The hours crawled. Her breathing grew labored, a wet rasp that filled the room. She spoke in delirium, fragments drifting. "The Bourbon rose. It bloomed, did you see? 3 buds, nearly crimson. Then quieter, he did not come. Of course he did not come." Julian closed his eyes. At dawn, when the maid relieved him to wash her face, he walked to the walled garden. The morning light slanted through the apple tree she had pruned. Everything was drenched and gleaming. He stepped into the folly and saw a small wooden box on the windowsill. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her handwriting. He sat on the stone step and read. "Today I planted lavender along the south path. The scent reminds me of my mother's garden in Kent. I wonder if Ashworth Hall will ever smell of anything but beeswax and silence." He wrote to tell me the roof requires inspection. I wrote back to say I had already seen to it. I doubt he read my letter in full. Sometimes I stand very still in the center of the garden and listen to the bees. It is the only place in the world where I do not feel invisible. The journal trembled in his hands. He turned the page and found the final entry, dated the day before the storm. "The cottage in the corner of the garden is nearly finished. I have been repairing it myself, a little at a time. A hearth, a chair, a narrow bed. No one knows of it. When the silence becomes too vast, I sit inside and imagine a life small enough to hold. Perhaps one day I will simply stay here, and no one will think to look." Julian pressed the journal to his forehead. A life small enough to hold. She had been planning to vanish, not into another county, but into a corner of his own estate, because she believed he would never search for her. And he had proven her right. He returned to the house with the journal tucked inside his coat. Mrs. Pretty met him in the corridor, her face ashen. "Your Grace, her Grace has taken a turn. The fever has worsened." He was at her bedside in an instant. Alina thrashed, her skin the color of tallow, her breath shallow and rapid. Dr. Harlow applied cold compresses to her brow and wrists, his expression unreadable. Julian took her hand again, gripping it as if he could anchor her to the world. "Alina," he said, his voice cracking, "you must stay, please stay." She did not hear him. Her chest hitched once, twice, and then went still. The world stopped. Julian heard someone cry out, a raw, broken sound, and realized it was himself. He pulled her into his arms, the journal pressing between them, and buried his face in her damp hair. A shudder ran through her body. She drew a ragged, desperate breath and another. Dr. Harlow pushed forward. "She is breathing, Your Grace. Let me work." Julian released her reluctantly, backing away until his shoulders hit the wall. He watched the physician's ministrations, his entire being reduced to a single, relentless prayer. He had not prayed since boyhood. He did not know to whom he was speaking, but he swore with a fervor that frightened him that if she survived, he would become a man worthy of her or spend the remainder of his life trying. Part 4. The crisis passed. On the fourth morning, Alina opened her eyes. They were dulled and confused, wandering the canopy of the bed before finding his face. Julian was sitting exactly where he had been for 3 days, unshaven, his cravat long discarded. "Your Grace," her voice was a whisper of sand. "I am here." He leaned forward, careful not to crowd her. "You have been very ill, do not try to speak." She blinked slowly. "The garden, the rose." "The rose is safe. I have been watering it myself." It was true. He had stumbled out each dawn, a watering can in his unpracticed grip, desperate to preserve the only thing that had kept her tethered to life. Her brow furrowed. She looked at him as though seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. Then weariness reclaimed her and she slept. During her convalescence, a letter arrived addressed in a bold, masculine hand. Julian recognized the name on the reverse, Henry Thorne. A cousin, he recalled, from the maternal line, a gentleman of modest property who had once, according to old gossip he had overheard but never heeded, harbored a deep affection for Alina before her family arranged the match with a duke. He broke the seal with more force than necessary. "Dearest Alina, I have heard troubling reports of your health. I would call upon you, but I fear my presence may cause you discomfort given the circumstances of your marriage. Know that I think of you often, and if you ever require a friend, my home is open to you. Yours in steadfast affection, Henry." Yours in steadfast affection. Julian crushed the letter, then smoothed it flat with deliberate care. He had no right to jealousy. He had built a fortress of neglect around her, and this man had simply noticed the door was open. He summoned Mrs. Pretty. The interview was uncomfortable. She told him, with the respectful reluctance of a servant who had long bitten her tongue, that her Grace had dined alone nearly every evening, received no callers, and attended no entertainments during his absences. The household had been under strict instruction not to trouble his Grace with trivial domestic matters. "She never complained, sir," Mrs. Pretty said. "Not once, but a woman cannot live on silence." Julian dismissed her and stood alone in the study where he had once called her a duty. The words clung to the air like wood smoke. When Alina was well enough to sit propped against pillows, he brought her a cup of beef tea and the letter, unsealed. "This came for you. I took the liberty of reading it. I owe you the truth of that, at least." She read it without expression and set it aside. "Henry was always kind." "You never spoke of him." "You never asked." She looked at the window, where rain traced slow paths down the glass. "He asked for my hand before my father accepted yours. I was not consulted." Julian lowered himself into the chair at her bedside. "I have been a fool, Alina, a blind, arrogant fool." Her gaze returned to him. It was steady, but there was no softness in it. "Are you saying this because I nearly died? Guilt is not the same as regard." "I know," he held her eyes. "I am not asking you to believe my words. I am asking for the chance to show you something different. When you are strong enough, I will take you to Brighton. The sea air will help, and I will be there, not in London, not in the study, with you." She studied him. He could feel her measuring the distance between his promise and 2 years of absence. Then she gave a small, single nod. "Very well, Brighton." She did not smile, but she did not look away. Part 5. Brighton in July was a watercolor of pale skies and salt-laced breezes. They took a house on Marine Parade, and Julian kept his word. He walked with her along the promenade each morning, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, her pace slow but strengthening. They sat on the shingle and watched fishing boats bob on the swell. He did not open a single dispatch. His secretary, bewildered, was sent back to London with instructions to handle all but the most urgent matters. Eleanor's color returned, the hollows in her cheeks softening. She began to speak more freely, not with warmth yet, but with a tentative curiosity. One afternoon, as they rested on a bench overlooking the channel, he asked about the garden. "Tell me everything," he said. "The roses, the sundial, how you found it." She was silent for a long moment. Then, haltingly, she began. She told him about the ivy-choked gate, the wild asters, the first pale shoot she had uncovered beneath a mat of dead bramble. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, and he realized she was describing not just a garden, but the architecture of her survival. "There is a cottage in the corner," she said, her tone shifting. "I repaired it myself, a hearth, a bed. I meant to live there." Julian's chest tightened. Live there, away from the house. Away from everything. She did not look at him. "I had decided to leave the marriage, Your Grace, not through the scandal of a formal separation, but simply by disappearing. I thought if I was no longer present to be ignored, perhaps I would feel less invisible." The wind pulled at her bonnet ribbons. Julian stared at the horizon, his throat working. "You were going to vanish into your own garden under my own roof, and I would not have known for weeks, months. I believed you would not look." He turned to her, his eyes raw. "You were right, and that knowledge will haunt me for the rest of my days." She met his gaze. "Why does it haunt you now? What changed?" "You nearly died in my arms." He took a breath. "No, that is only the moment I understood. The change began when I saw the garden, when I read your journal, when I realized I had been married to a woman of extraordinary grace and resilience, and I had treated her as a shadow on the wall. I do not expect your forgiveness, Eleanor. I am not certain I deserve it, but I am asking for the chance to know you, to truly know you." She was quiet. Gulls cried overhead. She removed her glove and for the first time reached over and placed her bare hand atop his. "You may try." They returned to Ashworth Hall in August. The morning after their arrival, Julian came to her after breakfast and asked, formally, as if petitioning a queen, if she would show him the garden. She led him through the iron gate and watched his face as he took in the full flourishing of summer. The Bourbon rose was heavy with crimson blooms. Lavender bordered the path in silver-green waves. The folly gleamed with fresh whitewash she had applied before her illness. He walked slowly, touching a leaf here, a petal there. When they reached the sundial, he stopped. "You kept my letters inside." She started. "You found them." "I found everything." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he took a simple silver locket on a chain. He opened it to reveal a single pressed rose petal, deep red, delicate as parchment. "I took this from the Bourbon rose while you were ill. I have carried it since. May I put it on you?" Eleanor's hand went to her throat. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He fastened the clasp, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. The locket settled below her collarbone, cool and light. "I have one more request." "What is it?" He knelt, right there on the flagstones before the sundial with the bees droning around them. "Teach me about the roses. Show me how to prune, how to feed the soil. I want to learn everything you have built here. I want to build it with you." She looked down at him, the Duke of Ashworth on his knees in the dirt, and something that had been frozen inside her began, very gradually, to thaw. She held out her hand. "Get up, Julian. The secateurs are in the folly." He rose, and when he took her hand, she did not pull away. Part 6. Autumn arrived in a blaze of copper and amber. Word spread through the county that the Duke of Ashworth had abandoned London entirely. Neighbors who had barely seen the Duchess in 2 years began to receive invitations. The Duke and Duchess were observed walking arm in arm through the village, attending church together, and, most astonishingly, gardening. A tenant farmer reported seeing His Grace with his sleeves rolled up, hauling a barrow of compost. The ton buzzed. Some called it unseemly. Others, the romantics, whispered that the Duchess had bewitched him. A few, like Lady Jersey, declared it the most hopeful thing she had heard all season. In late October, Julian informed Elena that he intended to host a ball in her honor. She demurred, her old reserve flickering. "Is that necessary? I am content as we are." "It is necessary for me," he said. "I want every person who ever pitied you or slighted you to see the woman I should have been proud to stand beside from the beginning. Will you grant me this?" She consented, though her fingers worried the edge of her shawl. The night of the ball, Ashworth Hall blazed with candlelight. Elena descended the staircase in a gown of deep green silk, the color of moss in the garden. The locket rested at her throat. Julian waited at the foot of the stairs, and when he saw her, he did not offer a polite bow. He crossed the hall and took her hands, lifting them to his lips. "You are magnificent," he said quietly. She flushed but did not demur. "You are making a spectacle of yourself, Your Grace." "I intend to." He led her into the ballroom where 100 heads turned. He did not release her hand. Instead, he signaled the musicians to pause and address the assembled guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for coming. Tonight I wish to honor my wife, Elena, Duchess of Ashworth. I have not been the husband she deserved. I was absent, neglectful, and blind to the treasure under my own roof. She endured this with a quiet dignity I can only admire. I stand here to say publicly what I should have said long ago. I love her. She is the heart of this house, and I am the most fortunate of men to share her life." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Elena stood very still, her eyes glistening. She had not expected a declaration so absolute. A voice drifted from the crowd, Lady Matherton, an inveterate gossip. "How theatrical! One wonders how long this devotion will last." Elena turned toward the voice, and for the first time in her married life, she did not shrink. "You need not wonder, Lady Matherton. We have a garden that requires constant tending. I assure you, His Grace has proven a most diligent gardener." Laughter rippled, sympathetic and surprised. Lady Matherton's mouth snapped shut. Julian looked at his wife with something close to awe. Later, when the dancing was done and the guests had departed, they sat together on the stone bench in the walled garden. The moon hung full and silver, turning the frosted grass to lace. Julian draped a heavy cloak over her shoulders and drew her against his side. "You silenced Lady Matherton," he murmured. "I silenced myself for 2 years. I find I have quite a store of words left." She tilted her head to look at him. "Did you mean what you said, before everyone?" "Every syllable." He touched the locket. "I know this does not erase the past. I know trust is not rebuilt in a single season. But I will spend every day of my life proving that you are not invisible to me. You are the most vivid thing in my world." She leaned up and kissed him, a soft, unhurried press of lips. It was not their first kiss. Those had come in the weeks before, tentative and sweet. But it was the first she initiated with full certainty. When they drew apart, the garden lay quiet around them, its sleeping borders waiting for spring. "I want to show you something," she said, and led him to the folly. Inside, the little room was clean and bare, but on the hearth she had placed a single candle. She lit it now, and the small flame filled the space with gold. "This was where I meant to hide," she said. "I want you to know it, all of it." Julian looked around the tiny sanctuary. "It will never be a hiding place again, but it can be ours, a place we come to remember what we nearly lost." She nodded, and they sat together on the narrow wooden bench, watching the candle burn, the shadows dancing on the walls. Part 7. A year later, the walled garden was unrecognizable. Not because it had been transformed, it had always been beautiful, but because it had become the center of life at Ashworth Hall. The gravel paths were neatly raked, the borders spilled over with phlox and hollyhocks, and the folly had been properly restored with a new roof and a small brick hearth where a kettle often steamed. On a warm June afternoon, the garden hosted a party. Long tables draped in white linen stood beneath the apple tree. Laden with strawberries and clotted cream, cold ham, and pitchers of lemonade. Guests strolled the paths, exclaiming over the roses. Henry Thorne was among them, chatting amiably with the vicar, his former affections long since gentled into a steady friendship that Julian had come to value. Elinor sat in a cushioned wicker chair near the sundial, a light shawl draped over her lap despite the warmth. The shawl disguised the gentle swell of her pregnancy, now in its 6th month. Julian knelt beside her chair, his hand resting on the armrest, his face alight with a contentment that would have shocked his former self. "You are supposed to be hosting," she said, smiling. "I am hosting. I am currently hosting, concerned for your comfort. Would you like more lemonade, another cushion, a footman to fan you with palm fronds?" She laughed. "You are absurd." "I am reformed." He pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "There is a difference." Across the garden, Lady Matherton was inspecting a delphinium with grudging approval. She had called twice that spring, and Elinor had received her with impeccable civility, never gloating, never reminding her of the ballroom slight. The victory lay in that very restraint. As the afternoon waned, the guests began their departures. Henry Thorne lingered to press Elinor's hand warmly. "You look radiant, cousin. Motherhood will suit you." "Thank you, Henry. Do visit again soon. Julian has promised to teach you the difference between a Bourbon and a damask rose, and I should like to watch that lesson." Henry laughed and took his leave. Julian walked him to the gate, then returned to Elinor's side. The garden was quiet now, the last servants clearing the tables. He helped her to her feet and wrapped an arm around her waist. "Shall we walk?" he asked. She nodded, and they strolled the familiar path, past the lavender and the peonies and the sundial whose inscription no longer felt like a warning. Tempus fugit. Time had flown, indeed, but it had carried them somewhere new. "I was thinking," Julian said, "about the day I found you here, in the rain. You were so light in my arms. I thought I had lost you before I had ever truly had you." "You had me, Julian. You simply did not know it." He stopped walking and turned her to face him. The evening light burnished her hair, and her eyes held that steady, quiet strength he had once mistaken for passivity. "I know it now. I know it every morning when you smile at me across the breakfast table, every time I see you with soil on your gloves, every moment I am privileged to stand beside you." She placed her palm against his cheek. "You have earned your place, husband. Not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small ones. That is how a garden grows." He covered her hand with his. "And a marriage." They stood together as the sun dipped behind the old brick walls, painting the garden in shades of rose and amber. The scent of honeysuckle drifted from the arbor. Somewhere in the branches, a thrush began its evening song. Julian leaned down and kissed her, slow and deep, the way a man kisses the woman who is his home. When they parted, Elinor took his arm and they walked toward the gate that led back to the house, where the lamps were being lit and the future waited. Behind them, the forgotten garden bloomed on, no longer a refuge from love but a testament to it. And in that quiet, blossoming space, where a neglected wife had once vanished into silence, a man and a woman had found each other, not too late but just in time.